Now that we created a complete project and we tested it and know that everything runs correctly, it's time to deploy our DBT project. When I introduced DBT at the very beginning, I said it would help us with the different statements of the development workflow. A development workflow will look something like we've done so far. Developing, normally it would be in a separate branch. Testing and documenting those models. And all of this in a development environment like we've used so far, that it has its own separate schema and it will be a separate user ideally. And after that, once all of this is ready, we are going to deploy it using version control and CI/CD as well in a production environment. So deployment at the end is the process of running these models that we created in our development environment in a production environment. Having this workflow, it's going to allow us to keep developing, to later deploy in the production environment, but without affecting the models that we already have running and testing in production. This deployment environment will run against a different schema. This will be using the production schema that I showed at the very beginning, which means that all of the models that we were creating before in dbt_Victoria, they're going to be created under production. So let's see how to run a DBT project in production. We saw in DBT Cloud that running the DBT model was simply running a command in the Cloud IDE. But DBT Cloud also includes a scheduler where we can create jobs and run them in production. These jobs are going to use the production environment, which means they're going to create those models in that production database. A single job can have multiple commands. So we saw that in the IDE, we were running always one command at a time. Here, we could actually separate them to have separate logs as well. Once we created our job, here we can see the creation of a job. Once we've created, we can trigger this manually, or we can actually schedule it to run it on their schedule basis. And this is how it's going to look like. The job is going to have every run that happened over time, and each run is going to have a log for the commands that we run in there. If the job is generating documentation, this can also be viewed under the details of the run. If one of the commands that we're running is dbt source freshness, in that case, the job will also have a link to the data sources, where it's going to show all of our data sources and the freshness. So here we can see that some of them, the data is fresh. There are others, they're close to the threshold that we had defined in the schema OML, and there are no stale branches. And lastly, a very important part of deployment is the continuous integration. Continuous integration is a normal practice in software development that establishes a regular immersion of those development branches into the central repository. And ideally, they would also include automated builds and test runs. The goal here is to reduce adding bugs to production code and maintain a more stable project. How can we do that with DBT? So we already know how to schedule jobs, and we know that in a job we can put as many commands as we want. We could enable to run those jobs from a webhook, from GitHub or GitLab, where we're hosting our repository. What is going to happen here is that once we open a PR, and this PR is ready to emerge, GitHub, it's going to send a webhook to DBT Cloud, and DBT Cloud will create a job that we've defined before, and it's going to start a run of this one. In this run, it's going to be using a temporary schema that has been created for the PR, and no PR will be able to be merged unless the run has been completed successfully. And here we can see how it would look like in GitHub. I'm now going to show you how to do this from dbt Cloud. First of all, if we go to the IDE, I've already committed everything that we've done so far, which means that now we can see it in our own repository, and it looks way more like the one from the week 4 in the SoonCam repo. We can see now that the main branch is now read-only. After the first commit that we ever do, the first commit, since it's the init of the project, we can commit it directly to main. But after that, main is going to be a protected branch in the Cloud IDE. Which means that if I want to keep development, I have to create a new branch, do my development, and then open a PR. And I can do all of this from here. Let's now go to environments. From the original dbt Cloud setup, you should have this development environment that we can have a look, and this is what you define with your own credentials. But we're now going to create a production environment. You can put any name you want. I chose to put production. The type you're going to use, it's deployment. We already have a development environment. We're going to use the latest dbt version. Here you could use a custom branch if you wanted to, but by default, it's going to use the main branch of your repo. And I already have it connected to the deployment credentials from my project, but I'm missing the data set. And here is where I'm going to use the schema that I created for a production deployment. Here you'll save it, and after that, you'll have it here, just like I have. Let's now go to shops. And let's create a few first shop. Let's put dbt build. And here we're going to use the environment production. We're going to tell it to use the version from the production. I could actually use any other version if I wanted. How many threads, again, I would like to use. The target name is going to use the default, which means that it's going to use that production schema that I define in the environment. We're going to tick here, which means that it's going to generate a docs after my deployment run. If we want it, we could run source freshness. In our case, we haven't really defined a source freshness, so it doesn't make sense. But if you wanted to, you could add it here, and then it would add an extra part to your shop that would show the source freshness. We're not going to put a run timeout. And here under the commands, you could add anything you wanted. So let's put things in different commands. Let's run dbt seed. Let's do a dbt run, and then let's do a dbt test. And here we could schedule it. We could use a cron schedule, or we can simply run this every day, a specific days of the week, and then just define the hour. And we're going to say that we want to run our project at something like every day, every 6 hours. Here under webhooks is where you could take this project, this job, to run on a pull request that I mentioned before. Okay, so now let's save this. And let's run this. We can see now that I refresh and the shop has successfully finished. If we go inside, we're going to see all of the steps. So at first, it cloned the repository, so then it would only always have the latest version of the main branch. It created the connection to BigQuery and invoked dbt deps, so to make sure it always has the latest packages that we've defined. And then it started running everything that we said, so the dbt seed, the dbt run, and the dbt test. And here we can see something very similar. And here we can see all of our tests. Here you could also see the debug and the console logs, so like more details about what actually ran. And you could also download those logs. And lastly, there's this extra command that I added, which is the dbt docs generate, that again has some logs. And this is because we ticked that we wanted to generate a documentation. Under model timing, you could see the models. In this case, it's not working for us. And then in the artifacts is where you could see the compile code and the manifest with the documentation. If you see, we can go to view documentation from here. And here we're going to see the data catalog that I mentioned before. So let's go to taxi rides. Let's go to any of our models. Let's say station green trip data. And here we have the information, the documentation that we added to all of our columns, the columns that have test. They also have it here. We can see the references, the tests that are added, the models that are using this model, the dependencies on this model. So nodes are always the sources, and then macros as well. Here we have the code that we wrote, and here we have the compile code. And which is very interesting to see here is that first the source it creates exactly the same. And now if we go to, let's say, 5 trips and check the compile code, we can see that here, instead of dbt my name, it put production. If we go here, we can see the lineage graph that we already saw in the Cloud IDE. And we can see one dependency, so the references and the dependencies. But if we were to open this, we could actually see the whole thing as well. In this case, it's also adding the sources for us. And here we could actually use the same syntax that we use to run models. So I could do fact trips, for example. If I were to update, we already know where it's going to disappear. All of this one's went green. And we go back to dbt Cloud. Let's go to account settings. Let's go to our project. And here under artifacts, we're going to see that there are 2 things, documentation and source freshness, plus the things that we have already set up when we created the project. And on the documentation, I'm going to link it to my dbt build project. And on the source freshness, I don't have anyone because I don't have any project that is actually running a dbt source freshness. But if I were to have, I would have it in here as well. And I could choose one. Let's go to save this. And now, if we go to here, let's refresh the Google Cloud. And now we can see that there's a documentation, and we can access directly the documentation from there. The same would happen if we were to add a source freshness. You would see it there as well. Let's go to the home, and then we can see here all of our runs. So over time, we're going to have everything. If we were to create more shops, we would have all of them in here. And we could also create several environments that run against those same production credentials. And we could also use those to group the runs as well. So up to here is everything that you need to create a project and run it in production as well.